Well, we need a brief statement of what each of the documents that you referred to in the course of your statement is about.
Okay. The first document that I read from was dated 1/21/1971 to all agents from SAC Portland. The subject was FBI intelligence letter for the president, and the code name for the program was Inlet. And here, in the letter, they describe a series of activities to provide for the president material that would be to his interest and to provide him with meaningful intelligence for his guidance. And it's interesting to note that the type of information designed in paragraph 6 that they refer to may be obtained through investigations not wholly related to the security field. So that raises a question of what is the validity and the justification for these kinds of activities. So I'm asking, what is Project Inlet? Who authorized it? Is it still in operation? Did it include political intelligence? And has the FBI ever gathered political intelligence? When and for whom?
Do you have any idea what Inlet's about? Any surmises, guesses?
Well, I think that Project Inlet is a program of political intelligence and political surveillance of people in the country that I think is unlawful and unconstitutional.
What do you mean by political surveillance?
Well, that means that you're surveilling people on the basis of their political thoughts and their positions that they've stated publicly. This could be a civil rights organization, a group of minority persons protesting their plight in society, maybe a group of anti-war people who we now clearly know have been thoroughly vindicated in their challenge on the immoral, illegal, and unconstitutional aspects of the Vietnam War. These kind of things, people who are on the left of the political spectrum, who because they challenge some of the policies of this country can be considered politically dangerous, when the Constitution of the United States provides in its First and Fourth Amendments guarantees that people have a right to state their views. People have a right to congregate and to meet. And when these programs are designed in such a way to make people victims and criminals and subject to attack and abuse and harassment simply by exercising their constitutional rights, that flies in the face of what democratic society is all about. And I'm trying to say to people that while we are following the budgetary dollars, the critical and bottom line question that we must never forget is that these hearings are really about the question of freedom, and whether or not these organizations that are ostensibly designed to protect and defend people's freedoms and civil liberties have in fact thwarted their civil rights and civil liberties. And I think as we proceed through these hearings, we're going to begin to see a pattern of electronic technology so far advanced that it really in some ways would probably make the First and the Fourth Amendment totally obsolete. And I think this is horrifying and shocking, and I'm sure that we'll begin to move into this area even further, particularly when we begin to talk with the NSA.
Okay, that's the first document you referred to this morning in the hearings. What else?
One other document that I read from that's very brief and I could repeat it. It's a document that tries to point out that the FBI has hired a significant number of informants. And what I wanted to do was to focus for a moment on a case that I thought spoke to the use of funds, the method of operation, and the capability of auditing these kind of functions. I did not use names. The gentleman from the FBI who were here, I'm certain, could have verified the narrative that I tried to present. In the early 1970s, a former member of the Minutemen organization was recruited by an FBI informant. As an FBI informant. He was the leader of a right-wing organization called the Secret Army Organization. The prime function of the informant was to surveil and harass activists. This is a political activist. While on the FBI payroll at $200 per month plus expenses, the informant participated in, and this can be verified, bombings and burglaries. During one of the burglaries, a gun was stolen. Some days later, that gun was fired at the house of an activist, shattering the elbow of a young woman. The informant was in a car from which the gun was fired. The informant took the gun and gave it to his FBI contact. Now, this is an employee of the FBI, an agent of the FBI. The agent took the gun and hid it under his couch for 6 months until the SAO member who did the shooting was apprehended by local police. Now, the incident finally cost the agent his job. And during the same period, this particular informant used money, at least indirectly, funded by the FBI to write up two interesting documents. One called Booby Traps, how to make booby traps. And number two, they developed at FBI expense a document called The Use of Ammonium Nitrate in High Explosives. So you put that document out in the community and then begin to say to people, these are the kinds of things that the new left and the political activists in the country are doing in an effort to intimidate or bring fear on the part of many American people, who would then say, well, these persons on the basis of their political views are trying to blow up America. But when you start to filter through this process, you find out that FBI funds are used, given to an informant, to develop these kinds of documents and circulate them to discredit some other elements of our society. And what I'm saying is, again, that same pattern. Are our federal agencies set up to protect and defend people's rights, or are they set up in such a way to discredit and to harm? And for whose political interest? This is supposed to be a democracy, and we should have the ability to tolerate the full range of political views without going into these kinds of absurd things.
Ron, I believe you said when you were asking these questions this morning that this happened in Berkeley.
No, I didn't say that this happened in Berkeley.
What I want to get at is, so far as you can say, where this information is coming from. Is this coming to you as a congressman, as you are briefed for these hearings, or did this come from the FBI itself?
Well, I have received material from persons who have been directly involved in these factors, people who have been on their own investigating these matters, from private citizens, from people who have made it their business over the past several years as sort of public advocate groups to study these agencies and to study abuses. And this is where I'm getting the information from. I would assume that people are giving us this information because they think we'll use it and try to use it as constructively and as effectively as we can in moving these hearings forward. When I mentioned with respect to one of my constituents, this was regarding a matter called the Security Index, where I received a communication from one of my constituents who had gotten this material, that a communication was made from the San Francisco office to Washington
of the FBI,
saying that we would not at this particular moment classify this person in such a manner that they will end up on the Security Index, but we will send information later. So my question is, what is the Security Index? What is the authorization for this index? How do they fund this? And is this another way to further harass and intimidate American citizens without any justification, without any real documentation? And again, I think that this is potentially a very dangerous kind of potential abuse in an open society. And so I use that letter simply to dramatize the point and to get them to respond in terms of what this program is, how it's funded, how it's authorized, etc.
Do you think this index is going to be the FBI's equivalent of a Richard Nixon's enemy list or the CIA's list of domestic people involved in subversive activities?
Well, no question. It comes from that. It flows very smoothly from that same kind of mentality, which I think is very frightening. And certainly Watergate and the impeachment hearings more than adequately and dramatically pointed out that when federal governmental agencies' power is unchecked, there's awesome potential for corruption, and that corruption can certainly abuse and harm and intimidate many, many American citizens. And my only point is simply this. Is this a democracy or isn't it? And if it is, in fact, a democracy, then you've got to have the appropriate safeguards. If it's a convenient democracy, then let's say that to people, and then let people decide whether they want to continue to live in those kind of conditions or whether they really want to see the kind of abuse on the part of governmental agencies totally removed. And I think that that's the responsibility of this committee if we're diligent about our business.
Okay, still another document you presented this morning.
Yes, now, there was another document that where I read from an FBI memorandum dated 5/9/1960. And this was to Mr. Sullivan from Mr. Brennan.
Do you know who they are at all?
No, I have to check this out. I'm sure that they're top echelon people in the FBI. And the subject is counterintelligence program, internal security, disruption of the new left. And then I read the first paragraph from this particular document. And it says, and I quote, "Our nation is undergoing an era of disruption and violence caused to a large extent by various individuals generally connected with the new left. Some of these activities urge revolution in America and call for the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. They continually and falsely allege police brutality and do not hesitate to utilize unlawful acts to further their so-called causes. The new left has on many occasions viciously and scurrilously attacked the director of the FBI in an attempt to hamper our investigation of it and to drive us off the college campuses. With this in mind, it is our recommendation that a new counterintelligence program be designed to neutralize the new left and to keep key activists. The key activists are those individuals who are the moving forces behind the New Left and on whom we have intensified our investigations. And I just asked a simple rhetorical question. I wondered if this program was started because the director was called names, but more importantly, here again we find a lumping of people, the New Left. So that means any person, any group, any individuals, any collection of people who they define as New Left may raise some very serious and important, legitimate questions that have to be raised. You know, I've been defined as part of the New Left, and I see myself as part of the New Left thrust. But I am in no way an advocate of violence. So what we do is to lump all these persons out there as a justification to take a whole group of people. It's like saying, you know, all blacks are lazy, or all Chicanos are this, or all Puerto Ricans are this, or all police are this, or all so-and-so are that. I think when you get into those kind of labels, there's awesome potential to abuse people. And so you take this kind of statement and you move against any organization that any informant or any agent or any person out there says is a New Left group. You automatically say that equals danger, that equals violence, and then you justify a massive program to infiltrate these organizations, discredit these organizations, even in fact print leaflets and put their names on them and circulate them around campuses, around community, and then say to people, look, this is what these persons are doing. When you start to check back again, you find that these documents are funded. And I have reams and reams of material here that can document very specific memorandums from various departments in the FBI where they in fact said our program will be to print certain leaflets, to print certain documents, and to circulate them around the community in an effort to discredit. Now, what is the role of the government to do this? That's like planning evidence on a person and then arresting that person and say you're guilty of a crime. And I think that with agencies with this kind of power have to be checked. And so I raised this issue to try to dramatize that point and get the committee going on looking at the whole issue of counterintelligence. And then I looked at another document and read from a document dated 3/4/68 to all special agents in charge from the director of the FBI entitled Counterintelligence Programs, Black Nationalist Hate Groups, Racial Intelligence. And I just read one part. It said, to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Then they have several names, but they blanked it out in the document that I was able to look at. It said, blank might be such a messiah. He is the mortar of the movement. That may be Malcolm X or so. Blank, blank, and blank all aspire to this position. Blank is less of a threat because of his age. Blank would be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines, nonviolence, and embrace black nationalism. That may very well be, say, Dr. Martin Luther King, who was an advocate of nonviolence. And they said, blank has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. Well, this is supposed to be a free society. Blacks and browns and reds and yellows and whites are supposed to be able to live in this country. Now, during the Civil Rights era, people began to raise the issues of prejudice, discrimination, racism, and oppression. And under the First Amendment to the Constitution, they have a right to raise these issues, and society needs to deal with those questions rather than to develop an entire program, you see, to prevent any kind of black person from rising to speak with some authority and some effectiveness to the critical problems that confront blacks.
Now, Ron, this is a document that was circulated, so far as you know, within the Justice Department or the FBI?
Absolutely.
And the date I noticed is about a month before Dr. Martin Luther King's death?
Yes.
Does that suggest anything to you?
Well, it certainly suggests to me that one of the major responsibilities of this committee is certainly in our recommendations, because I don't think that between now and January 30th, this committee is either going to open up the Kennedy assassination or the King assassination issue. But it seems to me that we ought to learn enough. And if there's documentation that raises serious questions, and I think that the documentation exists, that at least one of the recommendations ought to be that the Congress of the United States demand a reopening of the entire Martin Luther King death. And I think we need to look very specifically at the frightening question of whether the government in any way through its intelligence or what have you, had the slightest thing to do with that? I have no way of answering that question at this particular moment, and I would not allege it, and I think at this particular moment certainly would be irresponsible. But I think that when you look at how short a time this was, it certainly requires that we raise this question. I characterize this kind of thing as racist and extremely dangerous, and it should be appalling to all people when you engage in such things as racial intelligence, using taxpayers' money to do these kind of things. The era that we went through in the civil rights movement, raising these issues, America survived that. And it seems to me that it would be a hell of a lot stronger if we began to deal with the issues raised by the persons out there who were feeling the pain of racism, rather than spending money to go out there and oppress them. I think if you spend money to solve the problems that people raise, poverty and hunger and disease, rather than spending millions of dollars in these kind of cloak and dagger programs that in my estimation fly in the face of what our principles are all about, would be a better utilization of our time. And then I went on to ask a series of questions that I think are rather important. For example, does the FBI have an intelligence or counterintelligence program presently underway? If so, what are they? Did the FBI have a counterintelligence program to attempt to pit the Black Panthers against organized crime?
What's that about, Ron?
Well, we are just now beginning to receive some information that at least it was discussed in the COINTELPRO program with an effort to try to infiltrate the Black Panther Party and sort of try to direct it toward organized crime. You know, for example, drug traffic and these kind of things.
What's it you're saying?
Well, we can go into that.
Okay.
We'll go into that later with you.
Okay, we'll hear more of that from the voice you heard in the background is Ron Dellums' assistant, saying they'll talk about it more later.
Yeah, what is the FBI's role in this program where the code name is Garden Plot? Does the FBI operate in Canada in any role other than liaison? Some information that we've gathered that needs to be verified is that, in fact, they have operated in Canada in an intelligence fashion rather than simply liaison, which is in violation of their charter. Has the FBI ever provided confidential information to ITT, a major multinational corporation? Within the last decade, has FBI initiated any intelligence or counterintelligence programs against labor unions? Now, these are organizations designed to protect working-class people in this country and provide them a vehicle to negotiate the salaries on which they will work, the conditions under which they will work, and other kinds of fringe benefits. What role does the FBI have in any intelligence or counterintelligence programs against these labor unions, unless they're talking specifically about some issues of crime and law?
And again, by asking the question, you're implying that you have some information that suggests that something like intelligence surveillance has been going on of labor unions.
No question. Each question that I raise is as a result of gathering information that leads me to question in these areas. Has the FBI ever attempted surreptitiously to monitor the defense effort of federal defendants? For example, a person is a federal defendant, guaranteed all the constitutional rights and certainly guaranteed within the framework of our due process laws the assumption of innocence. Now, if the federal government is surreptitiously attempting to monitor through wiretaps and other things federal defendants, you actually violate their civil liberties, and that's wrong. Now, if the person is guilty of a crime and it's the responsibility of the state to prove that, then that is a principle that must not be tampered with. And we think that there is information that we hope we'll be able to document that will point out monitoring and other surreptitious, wiretapping and other surreptitious monitoring of the defense of people who are federal defendants. Has the FBI, any agent or FBI informer, ever authorized, directed, suggested, or otherwise participated in an assassination or assassination attempts? Now, that's obviously very horrifying and very frightening. But when you look at start to look at some of the data of the death of Fred Hampton in Chicago and other things, it leaves many, many, many questions unanswered. And it's personally very frightening to me, and I'm certain it should be frightening to many other people to even contemplate that possibility. All right? And so I think that when you look over that information, it leads you and forces you to raise these kinds of questions. Has the FBI ever initiated any operations or efforts against radio stations, news services, or newspapers? And I think that's self-evident. Has the FBI ever sought or obtained illegal access to bank records, which are private records of people? They ever sought to find out the assets and worth of various people without any right or authority whatsoever? Has the FBI ever participated in surreptitious entry operations without warrant, just breaking into people's homes? Were any with the CIA or the National Security Agency? Has the FBI ever participated in mail covers, opening the domestic mail of people without authority?
Now, Ron, I assume that when you ask these questions, you pretty much know what kind of answers, what the real answers are. Do you expect the FBI to come through with documentary proof provided to this committee of the answers that you think are true anyway?
I have to expect that. If a committee of the Congress that is a separate, independent, co-equal branch of government cannot gather this information, then our country's in serious trouble. The Constitution of the United States not only says that the Congress shall make laws, it says the Congress shall oversee the enactment of those laws.
Do you have indications that suggest to you that they will, in fact, provide you the information you want?
Well, let me say that I'm operating from the assumption that we will get anything that we is justified to ask for, and in the event that we don't get it, then I think there has to be a fight on that serious and important principal question. I'm certainly more than willing to fight for access to this information. Has the FBI any program against AIM, the American Indian movement? If so, what is the justification? Were COINTELPRO programs ever discussed with the Attorney General or Congress or other authorities? What authorization was there for the expenditure and manpower for COINTELPRO? Or was this simply an in-house program that was kept secret from the Congress, authorizing committees, Judiciary Committee, and others? They just set this program up inside without any checks, without any authority, without any control. If so, then that is an area that has to be corrected, and it also seems to me that where there are areas that need to be prosecuted, then I think we need to go into that as well. What is and has been the FBI relationship with the Bell Telephone Company and ITT? Obviously, if you're going to tap people's phones on a regular basis, you know, do we have informal or formal relationships with the Bell Telephone Company, which is a private company being used by public agencies to surveil? These are serious questions. I, for example, had a personal situation, one, where a gentleman on leave from a Maryland university to the University of California, a sabbatical, was an expert in electronic surveillance, signed an affidavit that the telephones in my congressional office in Oakland and Berkeley were being monitored by high-frequency radio equipment. Now, I'm a member of Congress. Anything that I say on the floor of Congress, or I say in my committees, or I say in public session. Why should the telephones of a public figure, or for that matter, any person without warrant or what have you, be monitored? All right, there was nothing that I could do about it. Another incident occurred.
Do you assume they're still monitored, Ron? I mean, now that you have a signed affidavit from an expert, there's still nothing you can do to make sure your phones are not monitored?
When I came back and said, I have a signed affidavit by an expert whose credentials are impeccable, what can I do? They said, we'll give you 1 day of hearings before a committee, and you can get some press out of it. Well, I wasn't interested in any press. I mean, I'm not here to be a press monger. But what I did want to find out is why is this happening, and can it be ended? What was essentially said to me was there's nothing that we can do about it because they may send somebody in to monitor to put another tap on your phone. So it's that kind of serious frustration. So that people think, well, members of Congress and public officials have all this power. Well, if I can have my phones tapped and can't do very much about it, what can the average private citizen do that does not have access to information? So the only way that I can fight back is to try to expose it. And this certainly is a legitimate vehicle to get at these kinds of abuses. There was another situation where a person who wanted to remain unnamed because they were an employee of the telephone company went to their union supervisor and said, I'm being assigned to routinely and regularly monitor the telephone conversations of Ron Dellums' congressional office, and I think that this is wrong. All right? Now, they then came to us. My office out there in California tried to handle the situation. Telephone company said, we didn't have anything to do with it. I know this person said, I would love to come public, but my personal situation is such that I'm afraid that I may get fired. And so I didn't pursue it because of the person's delicate personal situation. But I know that those phones were mine, so I don't care what they said. And I want to know, what is the FBI's relationship with ITT as an international, multinational corporation in the telephone and telegraph business, as well as our domestic phone lines, such as Bell Telephone Company. And we've got information that leads us to believe that those relationships exist. What is the law enforcement intelligence unit? Does it maintain files on American citizens? I think the answer to that is yes. Under what authority? I don't think there's any authority. Does it pass information to state and local agencies? My response to that, based on the preliminary information we have, is yes. And then I started to raise a few questions regarding the Drug Enforcement Agency. Explain the full nature and scope of the CIA's relationship with the Drug Enforcement Agency, including CIA personnel serving with the Drug Enforcement Agency, and give the committee full documentation. From briefings and preliminary information that I've seen, that there are an extraordinary number of so-called former CIA agents now with the Drug Enforcement Agency. It is terrifying to contemplate that question when you look at the fact that Bella Abzug's committee and other committees have looked at the issue of this so-called drug bust that was brought to the attention of the CIA by the Treasury Department, I think, with 100 pounds of heroin in the possession of an CIA operative, translating into $3.5 million worth of heroin in the streets of America. The CIA went to the Justice Department and said, don't prosecute this person. Now, when you start to see a pattern of employees exchange back and forth between these two agencies, even if you don't have documentation, you certainly have to raise the question, is this an isolated situation, or is this, in fact, a quid pro quo for services rendered on the part of organized crime? It's frightening to contemplate. And so I raised this question to try to get at this issue. And how many Drug Enforcement Agency employees have been fired or otherwise dealt with because of corruption? Give us the information. I would assume, based on preliminary information, that either zero or very, very few people, when there are reams and reams of material that speak to the whole question of corruption on the part of Drug Enforcement Agency officials and agents and personnel and informants. And so I simply raise a series of questions. My frustration in these meetings, and I don't particularly like to proceed by just sending a massive amount of material, but it was clear, one, that the witnesses before us on these matters could not answer the questions, and number two, it's very frustrating in a 5-minute situation. When I am controlled by 5 minutes, the witnesses are not controlled by 5 minutes. If they slow down their responses to your answers, at best you can ask 1, 2, maybe 3 questions. So I decided that my tact has to be, where I really need the information, is to cite the situation and raise a number of questions and ask for unanimous consent that the person provide extensive material, files, documentation, memorandum, etc. on these questions so that our staff can go over them and we can go over them and begin to try to develop some pattern. But sitting here every day asking 1 or 2 or 3 questions during a 5-minute period will never get this committee down the road where it has to go in order to, 1, look at the abuses, and 2, try to formulate some recommendations, serious recommendations on how you handle it.
One last question, Ron. We've had a week of hearings before the House Select Committee to investigate intelligence activities now. You think the committee is going to achieve anything?
Well, I think it has to. And first of all, when you look at the several days of hearings, even though much of the public information has been rather spotty, it certainly has begun to establish some trends among the various agency representatives who have come before us. The question of civilian control, the question of accountability, the whole issue of who authorizes many of these various programs, that our oversight function in the Congress is virtually non-existent, a pattern being established of 1 or 2 members of Congress being briefed on highly classified information, not even the subcommittees charged with that responsibility or the full committees that have ultimate responsibility of oversight. So it makes oversight a sham. So that's one pattern you're beginning to see. The other pattern, as I said, is this pattern of lack of control, lack of authority, and a lack of accountability. So that we have these agencies and Congress itself and American people have no way of forcing any kind of accountability. So you have bureaucrats who can go off willy-nilly in areas that can result in extreme danger to rights and even person where there's no control. There's a third pattern that I think is beginning to emerge, a pattern of, certainly with respect to the Central Intelligence Agency and other members of the intelligence community, where in a variety of different agencies where they have to interface with other agencies. Interesting pattern. So-called former agents or detailed agents are in those agencies in order to handle the transactions to quote, keep the cover. But the problem with that is that if all along the line, for example, a CIA agent is working on a program and has to interact with another regulatory or administrative agency, and in that agency, like the budget, there are agents there handling the budget, and then when you move to other agencies, they're handling that. Where's the civilian control? Where's the openness? Where are the checks and balances? So these kind of patterns are beginning to show, and I think that every single member on this committee, irrespective of their political views, have to be significantly aware of those kind of factors. And so I don't think we can run from it. It's clear to me, even in these first few days, that oversight in the Congress is a joke, absolute joke, ineffective, ineffectual, and really a travesty to the term. Again, as I said, we're constitutionally charged with this responsibility, but here we're spending billions of people's dollars on the basis of some priorities that affect how we spend money without control, without authorization, without civilian input, and without congressional insight. That's a horrifying situation.